President Donald Trump and First Lady Melania Trump were coming to town. They were scheduled to visit for a special charity event to help struggling farmers, men and women who had been fighting against droughts, rising costs, and the unpredictable turns of the agricultural market. Reporters from nearby cities had already arrived, their cameras set up near the old community center. Flags were being raised, signs painted, and curious onlookers gathered along the dirt roads just to catch a glimpse of the motorcade. Among the dozens of hard-working farmers invited to the event was Henry Thompson, a quiet, humble man who had lived his entire life on the same piece of land his grandfather had bought nearly a century ago. At 62 years old, Henry still woke up before dawn every day, feeding the animals, checking the soil, and making sure every acre of his corn and soybeans grew strong. His farm wasn't large or fancy, just a few hundred acres, a worn red barn and a small white farmhouse that had seen better days. But to Henry, it was everything. It was his pride, his identity, and his legacy. Every inch of it told the story of generations that had worked the land with faith and grit. Yet behind his calm smile, Henry carried a heavy burden. Years of poor harvests, broken machinery, and ever-rising expenses had pushed him dangerously close to losing it all. Many in Greenwood whispered that Henry would surely accept any help he could get. After all, the man had given everything to his farm. But what no one knew, not his neighbors, not the reporters, and certainly not the Trumps, was that Henry Thompson had something else on his mind that morning. Something that would surprise everyone. When he finally stood face to face with the president himself. When the motorcade rolled into town, the quiet streets of Greenwood erupted with cheers and excitement. Flags waved in the crisp breeze, children sat on their fathers' shoulders, and people lined the sidewalks with homemade signs reading, "Welcome, Mr. President," and "Thank you, Melania." Cameras flashed from every direction as the long line of black vehicles came to a slow halt outside the old community center, a building that had stood since Henry Thompson's grandfather's time. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Security agents scanned the room while reporters adjusted their microphones, eager to capture every word. President Trump and Melania stepped onto the stage to thunderous applause. Trump, confident and charismatic as ever, began shaking hands with local farmers, listening to their struggles and offering words of encouragement. Melania, elegant yet soft-spoken, smiled warmly at each person, taking the time to ask about their families and their farms. One by one, the farmers stepped forward to receive help. Donation checks meant to repair barns, replace tractors, and save livelihoods. Gratitude filled the air. Tears of relief flowed freely. And then came the moment everyone would remember. When Henry Thompson's name was called, the crowd applauded politely. He stood up slowly, his back slightly bent from years of labor, and walked toward the stage. President Trump stepped forward to greet him, reaching out a firm hand. "Henry," Trump began, his voice carrying through the hall, "I've heard about what you've been through. You've worked hard all your life, and America needs more people like you. I want to help you get back on your feet." The crowd nodded in agreement, admiring the moment, the president recognizing a humble farmer's dedication. Trump reached into a leather folder beside him and pulled out a check. The bold numbers shimmered under the lights, $100,000 made out to Henry Thompson. Gasps rippled through the audience. The camera zoomed in, capturing every second. Melania's gentle smile widened as she looked at the old man standing before them. Everyone expected him to break down, to cry tears of gratitude, but instead Henry slowly shook his head. His lips parted, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "I can't take this, Mr. Trump." The crowd fell silent. Even the clicking of cameras stopped. Trump blinked, caught off guard. "You can't take it? Why not?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. Henry looked down at his trembling, calloused hands worn by decades of toil. Then, with quiet strength, he lifted his gaze. His eyes weren't defiant, nor proud. They were filled with something far deeper, sincerity, conviction, and purpose. "Sir," Henry began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, I've lived my whole life on this land. My father and his father before him, they taught me that if you take something, you give something back. That's the way of life out here. You don't just accept help. You make sure what you take helps others too. I'm not here to take your money. The words echoed softly through the hall. The audience shifted uneasily, unsure how to react. President Trump frowned slightly, tilting his head as if trying to understand where this conversation was headed. Henry continued, his tone calm but filled with conviction. I don't need a donation. What I need, what all of us need, is hope. Hope for our small farmers. The young men and women out there who still wake up before dawn, who still believe in the power of the land, they're giving up. They're selling their farms to big corporations because they can't keep up. It's not that they've lost faith. It's that they've lost a fighting chance. Trump's expression softened, and Melania's smile faded into something more thoughtful. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every wrinkle of sincerity on Henry's face. His voice trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from years of unspoken frustration and love for the soil beneath his boots. I don't want your money for me, he said, his eyes glistening. What I want is a promise. A promise that this gift, this check, will become something bigger. Something that lasts. He paused, looking around the room at the other farmers, men and women who had shared his struggles. Promise me, Henry said firmly, that you'll use that money to create a fund for young farmers, those who still believe in this country, in hard work, in the land itself. Let them have a chance to build what we built. That's what will save farming in America. Not a check with my name on it, but an opportunity for the next generation. The crowd was utterly silent. You could have heard the wind rustling outside the windows. Even Trump seemed taken aback, his usual commanding presence replaced by quiet reflection. Melania's eyes shimmered, her lips parted slightly as she watched the old farmer speak from the heart. In that moment, everyone in the room knew. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about legacy, hope, and the soul of rural America. Trump turned to Melania, his expression unusually thoughtful. For a brief moment, the bustling room felt frozen in time. Cameras poised, reporters silent, everyone waiting for his response. Instead of speaking right away, Trump glanced toward his wife as if silently asking for her thoughts. Melania met Henry's eyes. The strong, dignified woman the world often saw now looked deeply moved. Tears shimmered in her eyes as she stepped closer. You remind me of my father, she said softly, her voice trembling just enough to reveal the emotion beneath. He was a hard-working man, honest, proud, and kind. He believed in giving, but more than that, he believed in purpose. What you're asking for? It's powerful, Henry. It's something we all need to hear. Her words hung in the air like a warm echo, touching every heart in the room. Trump nodded slowly, his usual confidence replaced with a rare humility. You're a good man, Henry, he said quietly. You really are, Henry gave a small, humble smile. I'm just doing what's right, he replied. This land has given me everything I have. The least I can do is make sure the next generation gets a chance to feel that same pride. Moved by his sincerity, Melania stepped forward and gently took Henry's rough, calloused hand between hers. You've given us something more valuable than we could ever give you. Perspective, she said, her voice breaking slightly. It's easy to give money. It's harder to give meaning. The room was utterly silent except for the faint hum of camera shutters clicking. Every person there, from security guards to reporters, seemed to understand they were witnessing something far more profound than a political photo opportunity. In that moment, it wasn't about politics, parties, or publicity. It was about humanity, one man's courage to speak truth and the willingness of others to listen. Trump turned back to the crowd, holding up the check. Henry's right, he said firmly. It's not about a donation. It's about building something lasting. That day, he announced the creation of the American Heartland Fund, a national initiative dedicated to supporting young and independent farmers. It would provide grants, mentorship, and tools to help small farms survive and grow. And it all began, not with a transaction, but with a single act of integrity from one humble farmer who refused to take a check. Weeks later, when the flashing cameras had disappeared and the headlines had faded from the front pages, life in Greenwood, Iowa returned to its usual rhythm. The morning mist once again rolled gently across the fields, and the sound of tractors echoed softly in the distance. When a group of reporters came back to the small town, hoping to see how fame had changed the man who had moved a president and brought a first lady to tears, they found Henry Thompson exactly where he'd always been, sitting beside his old red tractor, a wrench in hand, wearing the same dusty hat and faded overalls. His hands were dirty, his boots were worn, and yet his spirit seemed lighter than ever. As the cameras rolled and microphones were thrust toward him, Henry just smiled at the horizon, the golden fields swaying gently behind him. When asked how he felt about everything that had happened, the attention, the interviews, the national praise, he chuckled softly and said, "I didn't do anything special. I just told the truth. The land gives to us, but only if we take care of it. And each other." Those simple words spread across the country almost as quickly as the original story had. People shared them on social media, quoted them in speeches, and printed them on banners at agricultural fairs. Henry had become more than a farmer. He had become a symbol of integrity and humility in a world often driven by greed and self-interest. Meanwhile, the American Heartland Fund, launched by President Trump in honor of Henry's request, began making a real difference. Dozens of young farmers across the Midwest received grants to start or save their farms. Scholarships were created for agricultural students. Equipment loans were offered to help small farmers compete with corporations. Communities that had once felt forgotten now had hope again. Even Melania Trump spoke about the encounter in a later interview, her voice gentle and reflective. "Sometimes," she said, "the most powerful acts of kindness come not from accepting help, but from inspiring others to give in a better way." And so, in that quiet Iowa town, a farmer's refusal became a story for the ages. Henry didn't take the money. He gave the world a message that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the hearts we touch and the futures we build.